I was standing over my mother's open grave, the icy rain soaking through my black dress, when my husband leaned in. I thought he was finally going to offer a shoulder to cry on. Instead, he slipped a thick manila envelope into my trembling hands, whispered, "I'm filing for divorce. Savannah is pregnant," and walked away to his mother's waiting Mercedes. He left me stranded at the cemetery, thinking he had won. He didn't know that one phone call later, I would leave his entire family sleeping on the streets. The sky over Oakwood Cemetery was the color of bruised iron. It had been raining for three days straight, a relentless, freezing downpour that turned the ground into a muddy swamp. It felt violently appropriate. My mother, Margaret Hayes, was the only family I had left in the world, and she had just lost a brutal 6-month battle with pancreatic cancer. I was 32 years old, and I had never felt more like an orphaned child. I stood under a black umbrella, my fingers white-knuckling the curved wooden handle. The priest was murmuring words about eternal peace and heavenly rewards, but all I could hear was the deafening roar of my own heartbeat and the rhythmic splat of raindrops hitting my mother's mahogany casket. To my left stood my husband of 10 years, Daniel Kensington. He wasn't holding an umbrella. I wasn't even standing close enough for our shoulders to touch. He had his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his expensive Italian wool coat, his jaw clenched, staring at his waterproof Rolex every 3 minutes. Behind him stood his mother, Beatrice, and his younger sister, Rachel. They hadn't bothered to wear traditional mourning clothes. Beatrice was draped in a charcoal mink coat, her face tight with impatience, looking as though she had been forced to attend a peasants' gathering. Rachel was busy scrolling through her phone, not even pretending to pay attention to the solemn farewell of the woman who had spent countless Thanksgivings cooking for them. My mother had been a saint, a quiet, frugal accountant who wore the same winter boots for 8 years but would quietly pay off a neighbor's medical bills without taking any credit. She was my rock, and now she was being lowered into the earth. I turned slightly, seeking Daniel's eyes. I needed him. I needed the man who had promised to love me through sickness and health, for better or for worse. I gave him a pleading, watery look, a silent beg for him to just hold my hand. Daniel noticed my gaze. He let out a barely audible sigh, the kind you make when a stranger is holding up the line at a coffee shop. He took a step toward me. My heart gave a tiny, desperate flutter of gratitude. He leaned in, his breath warm against my freezing ear. "I need you to take this," he whispered. I looked down. He was pressing a thick, heavy manila envelope against my hip. I took it, confused, my numb fingers fumbling with the clasp. "Daniel, what is this?" I asked, my voice cracking. He didn't look at the grave. He looked straight into my bloodshot eyes, his expression completely devoid of anything resembling human empathy. "I'm filing for divorce, Chloe," he said, his voice as casual as if he were discussing the weather. "The papers are all there. My lawyer expects them signed by Friday. I'm moving out. Actually, I already have. And before you ask, Savannah is pregnant. I'm not going to let my son grow up in a broken home." Time stopped. The rain seemed to freeze in midair. The priest's voice faded into a low, distorted hum. Savannah. Savannah Reed was his 24-year-old junior marketing executive. The girl with the bright blonde extensions and the annoying laugh who had been helping him with late-night pitch decks for the last 8 months. Whenever I had questioned her late-night texts, Daniel had called me paranoid, insecure, and controlling. "What?" I gasped, the word barely clawing its way out of my throat. "Don't make a scene, Chloe." "Not today," Daniel muttered, his tone instantly shifting to one of irritated condescension. He stepped back, instantly creating a chasm between us. Without another word, he turned his back on my mother's grave and walked away. I stood there, paralyzed, clutching the divorce papers over my chest like a shield. I watched as he approached his mother and sister. Beatrice looked at me, a cruel, triumphant smirk playing on her lips. She didn't even try to hide it. She patted Daniel's shoulder approvingly, and the three of them climbed into her sleek, black Mercedes. The tail lights flashed red, and the car slinked away down the cemetery path, leaving me completely alone in the freezing rain. I don't remember the rest of the funeral. I don't remember the casket being lowered or throwing the handful of dirt on top. I only remember the stinging, suffocating realization that I had just lost the two most important people in my life within 72 hours. My best friend, Jessica, found me kneeling in the mud 20 minutes later. The umbrella had fallen from my hands. I was drenched to the bone, clutching the ruined, rain-soaked envelope to my chest, sobbing so violently I was gagging. Jessica drove me home. But when I turned the key to the 4-bedroom suburban house Daniel and I shared, the finality of his betrayal slapped me across the face. The entryway was barren. The vintage mirror we bought in Paris was gone. I ran up the stairs, leaving muddy footprints on the cream carpet. His closet was completely emptied. His watch window, his golf clubs, his safe, all gone. He had packed his bags while I was at the hospice center, watching my mother take her final breaths. He had planned this perfectly. He waited until I was at my absolute weakest, hollowed out by grief, to deliver the killing blow. I sank to the floor of our empty bedroom, the divorce papers scattered around me. According to the document, I was entitled to exactly nothing. We had signed a prenuptial agreement a decade ago, right before the wedding. At the time, I was 22 and blinded by love. I would have signed a contract giving him my kidney if he asked. The prenup stated clearly that I had no claim to the Kensington family assets, no claim to his business, and no right to spousal support. I was 32, utterly alone, entirely broke, and completely discarded. To understand the cruelty of the Kensingtons, you have to understand the illusion they projected to the world. The Kensington family lived in Fox Hollow, a sprawling, jaw-dropping 7-acre estate in the most exclusive zip code of our city. It had a private tennis court, a hedge maze, and a 6-car garage. Beatrice Kensington acted as the unofficial queen of the local high society. She hosted charity galas, drank $1,000 bottles of wine on random Tuesdays, and looked down on anyone who actually had to work for a living. When Daniel first brought me home to Fox Hollow 10 years ago, Beatrice had taken one look at my sensible sweater and my 4-year-old Honda Civic, and immediately decided I was a gold digger. "She's sweet, Daniel, really," Beatrice had said loudly in the kitchen on that very first night, making sure her voice carried into the dining room where I was sitting. But Margaret Hayes is an accountant for a regional paper supply company. They are pedestrian. You are a Kensington. You need a wife who understands our pedigree. Someone who can host. Someone who belongs in our circles. Not a girl who uses coupons at the grocery store. Daniel had defended me back then. That was the man I fell in love with. The man who told his mother to mind her own business. But over the years, the toxic drip of Beatrice's influence had corroded his spine. As Daniel climbed the corporate ladder at a tech firm, his ego inflated to match his mother's. He began wearing bespoke suits, leasing cars we couldn't comfortably afford, and complaining that my job as a high school English teacher was embarrassing to talk about at his networking dinners. For 10 years, I swallowed the insults. I smiled tightly at Beatrice's passive-aggressive comments at Christmas. I ignored Rachel's snide remarks about my clothes. I played the dutiful, supportive wife while Daniel worked 80-hour weeks. And my mother? Margaret bore the brunt of their elitism with a quiet, terrifying grace. I remember a Thanksgiving dinner 5 years ago. Beatrice had cornered my mother in the living room and pointedly asked, "Margaret, dear, have you ever considered investing in a better neighborhood? It must be so depressing living in that little box of yours." My mother had just smiled, taken a sip of her tea, and replied calmly, "My little box is completely paid for, Beatrice. Can you say the same about Fox Hollow?" Beatrice had turned purple with rage, marching away to complain to Daniel. I had thought it was just a clever comeback. I had no idea how deeply my mother's words had cut, or the massive, earth-shattering secret hiding behind that polite smile. Now, sitting in the ruins of my marriage, I read through the divorce petition again. Daniel's had drafted it with ruthless precision. It cited irreconcilable differences. It demanded that I vacate the suburban house within 30 days, as the deed was solely in Daniel's name, a tax strategy he had told me years ago when we bought it. I was so stupid. I was leaving me with nothing but my 10-year-old SUV and the meager savings in my personal checking account. He, on the other hand, was moving back into the guest house at Fox Hollow until he and Savannah bought their new mansion. I spent the next 3 days in a catatonic state of grief. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. I ignored the frantic calls from the school where I taught. The only thing that kept me breathing was a dark, festering rage that began to pool in the pit of my stomach. On the 4th day, my mother's estate lawyer, Arthur Pendleton, called me. "Chloe, I am so deeply sorry for your loss," Arthur said. His voice was warm, gravely and genuine. He had known my mother for 20 years. "I know this is a terrible time, but there are matters regarding Margaret's estate that require your immediate attention. She left specific instructions that you are to go to her house and open the floor safe in her study before we formally read the will." "A floor safe?" I croaked, my throat raw from crying. My mum didn't have a floor safe. She kept her important papers in a plastic binder. "She had a floor safe, Chloe," Arthur corrected gently, "under the rug beneath her sewing machine. The combination is your birthday and the year she adopted your childhood dog, Buster. Please, go there today. Call me when you have the contents." That afternoon, I drove to my mother's house. It was a modest, single-story ranch home in a quiet, working-class suburb. Walking through the front door felt like stepping into a shrine. It smelled like cinnamon, old books, and the faint, sterile scent of the hospice medications that had dominated her final months. I walked into her small study. It was exactly as she left it. Stacks of tax code books, a vintage Singer sewing machine, and her favorite armchair. I pushed the heavy sewing table aside and rolled back the braided rug. Sure enough, embedded in the hardwood floor was a steel combination dial. My hands shook as I entered the numbers. 08149 6. With a heavy clack, the lock disengaged. I pulled the heavy steel door open. Inside the safe were 3 things: a velvet jewelry box containing her grandmother's wedding ring, a sealed envelope with my name written in her elegant, looping cursive, and a massive, thick leather binder stamped with the logo of a private wealth management firm, Vanguard Trust and Assets. I took out the letter first and tore it open. My dearest Chloe, if you are reading this, my battle is over, and I am finally at peace. I hate to leave you, my beautiful girl, but I know how strong you are. You have always possessed a fire that the Kensington family tried desperately to extinguish. I am writing this because I have kept a secret from you for 7 years. I did it because I knew you loved Daniel, and I wanted your marriage to survive. I knew that if Daniel's pride was shattered, he would take it out on you. 10 years ago, Beatrice Kensington made a fatal miscalculation. She assumed that because I lived simply, I was poor. But you know I've been an accountant for 40 years. What you didn't know is that 20 years ago, I invested early in a little startup called Amazon. I also bought heavily into real estate before the market boomed. I never cared for luxury, Chloe. I only ever cared about security. Your security. 7 years ago, Daniel's late father made terrible investments. The Kensingtons were quietly facing total bankruptcy. Fox Hollow was going into foreclosure. The banks were going to throw Beatrice and Rachel into the street, and Daniel's precious reputation would have been destroyed. Beatrice came to my house in the dead of night. She begged me on her knees for a loan. She didn't know the extent of my wealth, but she knew I had excellent credit and liquid cash. She was desperate. I didn't give her a loan. Instead, I set up an anonymous LLC, Blackstone Holdings. Through Blackstone, I bought the Kensingtons' debt from the bank. I bought the mortgage to Fox Hollow. I am their sole creditor. For the first 3 years, they made the minimum payments. But for the last 4 years, Beatrice has paid absolutely nothing. They are in catastrophic default. I allowed it, quietly paying the property taxes myself, solely because I did not want to trigger a financial crisis that would ruin your marriage with Daniel. I let them live in their illusion of grandeur so you could have peace. But I am gone now, and my protection of the Kensington family dies with me. The binder in this safe contains the original promissory notes, the deed of trust, and the default notices I never filed. Upon my death, sole ownership of Blackstone Holdings transfers to you. Chloe, listen to me carefully. If Daniel has been the husband you deserve, you can tear up the debt and give them the house as a final gift from your eccentric mother. But if they have hurt you, if they have ever made you feel less than the absolute queen you are, I want you to burn their empire to the ground. I love you forever, Mum. I sat on the floor of my mother's study for a full hour, the letter trembling in my hands, the silence of the house pressed in on me, broken only by the ragged, jagged sounds of my own breathing. I placed the letter on the floor and pulled the heavy leather binder from the safe. It hit the hardwood with a dense, authoritative thud. I opened it. My mother had not exaggerated. She was an accountant to her core. Every single document was meticulously organized, tabbed, and highlighted. There it was, in stark, undeniable black and white. Promissory note. Principal amount, $4.2 million. Debtor, Beatrice Kensington and the estate of Richard Kensington. Creditor, Blackstone Holdings, LLC. I flipped the page. There was a ledger, tracking their payments. For the first 36 months, there were regular wire transfers. And then, a sea of red ink. Missed payment. Missed payment. Notice of arrears. And yet, despite being millions in debt, despite living in a house they technically didn't own, Beatrice continued to host her lavish garden parties. Rachel continued to buy designer handbags. Daniel continued to lease his luxury cars. They funded their lifestyle on credit cards, and the arrogant assumption that the anonymous Blackstone Holdings would never actually foreclose on a family of their social standing. They had no idea that the ruthless corporate entity holding their leash was the unassuming, coupon-clipping mother-in-law they openly mocked. A manic, hysterical laugh bubbled up from my chest. It started as a chuckle and erupted into a full-blown, sobbing laugh. I laughed until my ribs ached and tears streamed down my face. Daniel had handed me divorce papers at my mother's funeral. He had told me he was leaving me for his pregnant, 24-year-old mistress. He had kicked me out of our home, secure in the knowledge that his prenup protected his family wealth, believing I would crawl away into poverty, utterly broken. He had no idea that his family didn't have a dime. He had no idea that the house he grew up in, the estate he was currently retreating to, belonged to me. I wiped my face, feeling a sudden, terrifying shift inside my own mind. The crushed, grieving widow who had been crying in the mud at Oakwood Cemetery was gone. In her place, something cold and sharp had been born. I picked up my phone and dialed the number on Arthur Pendleton's business card. He answered on the second ring. "Chloe? Did you find it?" Arthur asked. "I found it, Arthur," I said. My voice didn't shake. It was dead calm. "I'm looking at the ledger for Blackstone Holdings." Arthur let out a heavy sigh on the other end of the line. "Your mother swore me to secrecy, Chloe. She didn't want you burdened with the Kensington's financial mess while she was alive. She knew how cruel Daniel could be. She told me she was hoping for the best, but preparing for the worst." "Arthur," I interrupted, staring at the signature on the promissory note. Beatrice's arrogant, sprawling handwriting. "Daniel served me with divorce papers at the cemetery today. At my mother's grave. He's leaving me for his pregnant mistress. He's invoked the prenup, and he's kicking me out of our house." There was a stunned, heavy silence on the line. I could hear Arthur breathing. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost all of its warm, grandfatherly tone. It was the voice of a shark smelling blood in the water. "I see," Arthur said quietly. "In that case, Chloe, what are your instructions regarding Blackstone Holdings?" I stood up, holding the binder against my chest. I looked out the window at my mother's overgrown garden. "Arthur, what is the legal protocol for a defaulted mortgage of this magnitude? As soon as the sole beneficiary of Blackstone Holdings, you have the right to accelerate the debt," Arthur explained smoothly, "which means calling in the entire $4.2 million principal immediately. When they inevitably fail to produce the funds, we execute a notice of default, followed by an immediate eviction. Because they have been in default for over 48 months, we can bypass standard mediation. I can have the sheriff lock the gates of Fox Hollow by Friday. Friday, the exact day. Daniel's lawyer wanted my signed divorce papers. "Do it," I whispered. "Chloe, once we file this, it becomes public record. The Kensington name will be dragged through the mud. They will be utterly ruined." "Arthur, I don't just want them ruined," I said, a dark, vindictive smile spreading across my face for the first time in weeks. I want to be there when the locks are changed. I want them thrown out on the street. File the papers. Consider it done, Mrs. Kensington. Or should I say, Ms. Hayes? I will draft the acceleration notice tonight. The bailiffs will be scheduled for Friday morning. I hung up the phone. I looked around my mother's small, safe house. She had played the long game. She had endured their insults, their arrogance, and their disrespect, all while quietly holding the axe over their necks. She had given me the ultimate weapon. I packed the binder into my bag and drove back to the house Daniel and I had shared. It was technically still my residence for the next 30 days. When I walked inside, the house felt different. It was no longer a tomb of my failed marriage. It was a war room. Over the next 2 days, I played my part flawlessly. I ignored Daniel's texts demanding to know if I had reviewed the divorce settlement. I let his lawyer leave aggressive voicemails. I packed my belongings slowly, boxing up 10 years of my life. On Thursday evening, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Daniel. Daniel, my lawyer says you haven't signed. Stop stalling, Chloe. It's pathetic. Savannah and I are flying to Aspen this weekend to celebrate the baby, and I want this finalized before we leave. I'm dropping by Fox Hollow tomorrow morning to pick up some of my mother's vintage luggage. Have the papers signed and on the kitchen counter by noon, or we take this to court and I bury you in legal fees. I stared at the glowing screen. He was going to Fox Hollow tomorrow morning. Perfect. I typed my reply. Chloe, the papers will be signed tomorrow. Have a nice trip to Aspen. I put the phone down, poured myself a glass of cheap wine, and smiled. Let them pack for Aspen. Let Beatrice polish her silver. Let Rachel brag to her friends about her trust fund. They were all going to wake up tomorrow to a nightmare they couldn't buy their way out of. Friday morning dawned crisp and clear, the lingering storm clouds finally giving way to bright, blinding sunlight. It was a beautiful day for an eviction. I pulled up to the wrought iron gates of the Fox Hollow estate at exactly 8:02 a.m. Parked on the shoulder of the private tree-lined drive were 2 white sheriff's cruisers, their light bars flashing a silent, authoritative red and blue against the morning dew. Standing beside them was Arthur Pendleton, holding a leather briefcase, looking remarkably sharp in a navy pinstripe suit, accompanied by Sheriff Campbell and 3 armed deputies. I stepped out of my 10-year-old SUV. I wasn't wearing morning black anymore. I wore a tailored crimson blazer, a crisp white blouse, and a smile I couldn't quite suppress. "Good morning, Chloe," Arthur greeted, his eyes twinkling with a dangerous kind of professional glee. "The paperwork is finalized, signed by a judge late last night. The property officially belongs to Blackstone Holdings. We have the writ of possession." "Let's go knock on my new front door," I replied. The gates were wide open, likely expecting a delivery or a landscaping crew. We drove the cruisers up the long, winding driveway, the crunch of gravel echoing loudly in the quiet, moneyed neighborhood. We parked right in front of the grand portico, blocking in Daniel's leased Porsche and Beatrice's Mercedes. Before Sheriff Campbell could even ring the bell, the massive oak front doors swung open. Beatrice Kensington stood in the threshold, wrapped in a floor-length silk robe, holding a delicate china teacup. Behind her in the foyer, I could see 2 large vintage Louis Vuitton trunks, packed and ready for Daniel's celebratory Aspen trip. Beatrice's haughty expression immediately soured into a vicious scowl when she saw me standing next to the police. "Chloe, what in the world is the meaning of this?" Beatrice snapped. Stepping out onto the porch, she looked at the sheriff, her tone instantly adopting the cadence of a woman who was used to ordering people around. "Officer, I don't know what kind of domestic stunt my soon-to-be ex-daughter-in-law is pulling, but I want her removed from my property immediately. She is trespassing." Daniel appeared behind his mother, holding a half-eaten piece of toast. He froze when he saw the cruisers. "Chloe, are you insane?" Daniel barked, pushing past Beatrice. "I told you to leave the signed divorce papers on the counter. Did you honestly bring the police here to harass us? I will call my lawyer right now and have you arrested for this." "You don't need to call your lawyer, Daniel," Arthur interrupted, stepping forward smoothly and pulling a thick stack of stapled documents from his briefcase. He handed them directly to Sheriff Campbell. "Mr. Kensington, Mrs. Kensington, I am Arthur Pendleton, representing Blackstone Holdings, LLC. We are executing a court-ordered eviction and immediate seizure of this property due to catastrophic default on a $4.2 million promissory note." Beatrice's face drained of all color. The teacup slipped from her fingers, shattering on the flagstone porch, sending hot Earl Grey tea splashing across her expensive velvet slippers. "Blackstone," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. No, that's impossible. We have an arrangement with them. They don't foreclose. Your arrangement was with the previous owner of Blackstone Holdings," Arthur corrected sharply. "Margaret Hayes, Chloe's mother. She passed away this week, as you well know. Upon her death, full ownership and executive control of Blackstone Holdings transferred to her sole heir, Chloe." Daniel whipped his head around to look at me, his eyes wide with a frantic, uncomprehending panic. "Margaret? Your mother? The accountant?" He let out a breathless, desperate laugh. "That's a joke. That's a lie. My mother wouldn't borrow money from that." "From your mother?" "Ask her, Daniel," I said, crossing my arms, staring him down with 10 years of suppressed rage. Daniel looked at Beatrice. She was physically shaking, backing away from the door, her hands covering her mouth. "Mom?" Daniel asked, his voice cracking. "Mom, tell me this is a joke. Tell me we own this house." "We were bankrupt, Daniel," Beatrice shrieked, tears of utter humiliation finally spilling over her expertly applied makeup. "Your father left us with nothing. She was the only one who would buy the debt without taking it public. I had to protect our reputation." Rachel, who had wandered downstairs in her pajamas to see what the commotion was about, let out a piercing scream. "Wait, we don't own the house? We're broke?" Sheriff Campbell stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on his duty belt. "Folks, I don't care about the family drama. The judge has signed the order. You have exactly 30 minutes to gather whatever personal clothing and toiletries you can fit into those trunks, and you need to vacate the premises. The bank and Blackstone Holdings will be taking inventory of the furniture, art and vehicles to satisfy the remaining debt." "30 minutes!" Daniel exploded, his face turning a dangerous shade of purple. He lunged toward me, his fists clenched, but 2 deputies instantly stepped in his path, pushing him back against the heavy oak door. "Chloe, you malicious witch! You can't do this. I am your husband. Half of what is yours is mine. I'll sue you for half of Blackstone Holdings." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed off the massive pillars of the portico. I stepped past the deputies, getting right into Daniel's face. He smelled like expensive cologne and absolute terror. "You can't sue me for a dime, Daniel," I whispered, my voice dripping with venom. "Because a decade ago, You and your mother forced me to sign a very ironclad prenuptial agreement. Do you remember? Daniel's breath hitched. I could actually see the gears grinding in his head as the reality of his own arrogance crashed down on him. 10 years ago, when Beatrice had insisted I sign the prenuptial agreement, Daniel's aggressive pit bull of a lawyer, Mr. Harrison, had drafted it. To ensure I could never touch the Kensington fortune, Harrison had included a brutally comprehensive clause regarding inheritances and separate entities. Let me refresh your memory, Arthur chimed in from the steps, pulling another document from his briefcase. Clause 4, Section B of your prenuptial agreement explicitly states any assets, properties, inheritances, or business entities acquired by either party prior to or during the marriage shall remain the sole and separate property of that individual, immune from marital division. You insisted on that clause, Daniel, to protect Fox Hollow from Chloe. Ironically, it completely protects Chloe's inheritance of Blackstone Holdings from you. Daniel looked like he was going to vomit. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean against the door frame to stay upright. No, Daniel choked out, rubbing his face frantically. No. There has to be a loophole. I'll call Harrison. Call him from a motel, son, Sheriff Campbell said gruffly. Your 30 minutes are ticking. Move. What followed was the most pathetic, humiliating display of wealth stripping I had ever witnessed. Beatrice, sobbing hysterically, tried to stuff her mink coats and designer jewelry into garbage bags, only to be stopped by the deputies. Arthur informed them that all luxury goods purchased with Blackstone's suspended debt payments were technically collateral. They were permitted to leave with basic clothing, essential toiletries, and nothing else. Rachel was screaming at the top of her lungs, sitting on the grand staircase, refusing to move until a deputy threatened to handcuff her for obstructing a court order. At 8:45 a.m., the Kensingtons were escorted out of their mansion. Because their luxury cars were leased through a holding company attached to the defaulted estate, the keys were confiscated. They were left standing on the curb at the end of the long driveway, surrounded by 4 meager suitcases as the neighborhood began to wake up. A neighbor walking, a golden retriever, stopped and stared openly. A luxury landscaping crew driving past slowed down, the workers pointing at the Queen of Fox Hollow, sitting on a cheap plastic suitcase, her silk robe dragging in the dirt. I stood at the gates with Arthur, watching the locksmiths arrive to change the locks on my new multi-million-dollar estate. Daniel's phone rang. He fumbled it out of his pocket. I could see the caller ID from where I stood. It was Savannah. Daniel answered it frantically. Savannah, baby, listen to me. There's been a massive misunderstanding. Even from 10 feet away, I could hear Savannah's shrill, panicked voice leaking through the phone's speaker. Daniel, your credit card just declined for the Aspen Resort, and Mr. Harrison just called the office looking for you. He said you're bankrupt. Are you broke, Daniel? Are you actually broke? Savannah, calm down. I can fix this. Just wire me some money for a hotel for a few days. A hotel? Are you out of your mind? Savannah shrieked. I'm not paying for your hotel. I'm 24, Daniel. I'm not moving into a Motel 6 with a broke, middle-aged man and his horrible mother. Do not call me again. The line went dead. Savannah, the loyal mistress, had bolted the exact second the money evaporated. Daniel lowered the phone, staring at the black screen. He looked up at me. The arrogant, dismissive man who had handed me divorce papers over my mother's open grave was completely gone. In his place was a broken, terrified shell of a man who realized he had just thrown away the only person who had ever truly loved him, purely to protect an illusion that didn't even exist. "Chloe, please," Daniel begged, his voice cracking, tears streaming down his face. He took a step toward the gates, reaching his hand out through the iron bars. "Chloe, I made a mistake. A horrible, terrible mistake. I was stressed. Savannah meant nothing to me. Please don't do this. My mother is an old woman. Where are we supposed to go?" I looked at Beatrice, who was weeping uncontrollably on her suitcase, and Rachel, who was frantically texting people who were undoubtedly ignoring her. I stepped up to the iron gate, looking Daniel directly in his pleading, bloodshot eyes. "You said you didn't want your son growing up in a broken home, Daniel," I whispered, my voice completely devoid of pity. "Well, he won't be. Because he won't have a home at all." I turned my back on them and walked up the driveway toward my estate. The heavy iron gates slammed shut behind me with a loud, satisfying metallic crash, locking the Kensingtons out in the cold. The echo of the iron gates, slamming shut, felt like the ringing of a victory bell. For the first time in 10 years, I breathed in the crisp morning air and felt absolutely weightless. I turned around and looked up at the sprawling stone facade of Fox Hollow. It was no longer a monument to my humiliation. It was the spoils of a war I hadn't even known my mother was fighting. Arthur and I spent the rest of the day conducting a preliminary inventory with an estate liquidator named Thomas. What we uncovered over the next 8 hours was a masterclass in pathetic, desperate deception. As Thomas's team began cataloguing Beatrice's legendary walk-in closet, I heard a sharp bark of laughter from the second floor. I walked up the grand staircase and found Thomas holding a vintage Birkin bag under a magnifying glass. "Well, Ms. Hayes, I hope you weren't counting on a windfall from the widow's wardrobe," Thomas chuckled, tossing the bag onto a pile of silk scarves. "What do you mean?" I asked. "Beatrice insured this closet for $500,000. "She committed insurance fraud, then," Thomas replied, picking up a purportedly diamond-encrusted Cartier watch. He scratched the face with a metal tool. It left a deep groove. "Fake. The Birkin is a high-grade replica from Shanghai. The Chanel suits. Counterfeit. Even the Manolo Blahniks are knockoffs. From the looks of it, Beatrice has been secretly selling off her authentic pieces for the last 4 years and replacing them with fakes just to keep up appearances at her country club." I stared at the pile of worthless counterfeit luxury. Beatrice Kensington, the woman who had mocked my mother's sensible boots, had been parading around town in plastic diamonds and synthetic leather, terrified that her wealthy friend would discover she was nothing but a hollow shell. But the most damning discovery wasn't in Beatrice's closet. It was in Daniel's home office. While searching for financial documents related to the estate, I found a false bottom in his heavy mahogany desk. Inside was a sleek, black external hard drive and a secondary, prepaid burner phone. I plugged the hard drive into my laptop. It wasn't encrypted. Daniel was far too arrogant to think he'd ever be investigated. As I opened the spreadsheets, a cold, hard knot of realization formed in my stomach. Daniel hadn't just been drowning in his mother's debt. He had been actively stealing to keep his own head above water. The spreadsheets detailed a highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme. As a senior VP at Apex Technologies, Daniel had authority over external marketing budgets. He had been creating fake vendor invoices, funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars of corporate funds into offshore shell accounts, and the name explicitly tied to authorizing those fake vendor payouts. Savannah Reed. Suddenly, Savannah's abrupt departure made perfect sense. She hadn't just dumped Daniel because he was broke. She was a junior executive whose name was all over federal wire fraud. The moment Daniel lost his shield of wealth, she realized she was going to take the fall for his crimes. She wasn't fleeing a broke boyfriend. She was fleeing an impending federal indictment. I called Arthur into the office and turned the laptop toward him. Arthur, how legally binding is my mother's confidentiality clause regarding Daniel's personal files found on my property? Arthur adjusted his glasses, scanning the spreadsheets. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Chloe, you are simply a concerned citizen who discovered evidence of a felony abandoned on your newly acquired real estate. In fact, it is your civic duty to turn this over to the authorities. I believe the FBI's white-collar crime division would be highly interested in this. Let's not stop there, I murmured. Make a copy. Send the original to the FBI, and send the copy directly to Gregory Lawson, the CEO of Apex Technologies. Over the next 3 weeks, the Kensington family's descent into hell was swift and absolute. With Fox Hollow seized, their assets frozen, and their credit scores decimated, Beatrice and Rachel were forced to move into a tiny, roach-infested, one-bedroom apartment in the industrial district. The only landlord willing to accept a cash deposit without running a background check. Rachel, who had spent her entire adult life mocking working-class people, was suddenly forced to take a job as a hostess at a chain diner just to pay for her mother's blood pressure medication. Beatrice, I heard through the grapevine, had been blacklisted from the country club and completely ostracized by the high society friends who once kissed the ground she walked on. When she reached out to them for loans, they didn't just say no, they blocked her number. But Daniel's fate was the crown jewel of my vengeance. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, exactly 1 month after my mother's funeral, federal agents raided the Apex Technologies headquarters. Daniel was dragged out of a board meeting in handcuffs, his bespoke suit wrinkled, his face pale and slick with terrified sweat. The footage was caught by local news crews and broadcasted on every network in the city. Savannah was arrested 2 days later at an airport in Miami, trying to board a one-way flight to Costa Rica. And the cherry on top? During her interrogation, Savannah immediately turned state's witness. She confessed to the entire embezzlement scheme, completely throwing Daniel under the bus to save herself. Furthermore, her medical records were subpoenaed. She was never pregnant. It had been a desperate, calculated lie to force Daniel into divorcing me and marrying her before the Apex auditors realized the money was missing. She had wanted to secure spousal privilege and half of his perceived wealth before the house of cards collapsed. Daniel had thrown away a loyal 10-year marriage for a counterfeit life, a counterfeit baby, and a counterfeit mistress. The criminal trial of Daniel Kensington took place 8 months later. I sat in the second row of the gallery, wearing a perfectly tailored black dress, not for mourning, but for an execution. Daniel sat at the defendant's table, looking at least 10 years older. His hair was thinning, his posture was slumped, and the arrogant, untouchable aura he used to project had completely evaporated. His public defender, because he couldn't afford a real lawyer, looked utterly defeated. When the judge handed down the sentence, the courtroom was dead silent. Daniel Kensington, for the charges of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and grand larceny, you are hereby sentenced to 96 months in federal prison without the possibility of early parole. 8 years. Daniel dropped his head onto the wooden table and began to sob. It was a loud, wretched, pathetic sound. I looked across the aisle. Beatrice was sitting there, clutching a crumpled tissue. She looked like a ghost of her former self. Her hair was undyed, showing a brittle, stark white. She wore a faded beige sweater from a discount store. When the bailiffs pulled Daniel to his feet to escort him away, Beatrice reached out, wailing his name. But he didn't even look at her. As I walked out of the courtroom, I heard a frail voice call my name. Chloe. I stopped in the marble hallway and turned around. Beatrice was standing a few feet away, leaning heavily on Rachel's arm. Rachel wouldn't even meet my eyes. She stared firmly at the floor. Chloe, please, Beatrice rasped. The haughty, aristocratic venom was gone, replaced by the desperate begging of a broken woman. Please, I have nothing. Rachel can barely pay the rent. We don't have enough for groceries. You have everything. You have millions. Margaret wouldn't have wanted us to starve in the gutter. Show some mercy. Just a small stipend. Anything. I stared at the woman who had spent a decade treating me like dirt on her shoe. I thought about how she had mocked my mother's home. I thought about the sheer, unadulterated cruelty she had bred into her son. Margaret didn't want you to starve, Beatrice, I said, my voice eerily calm and cold, echoing off the marble walls. Margaret bought your debt to keep a roof over your head. Margaret protected you. And how did you repay her? Your son handed me divorce papers while I was standing over her open grave. Beatrice flinched, as if I had physically struck her. You reap what you sow, Beatrice, I continued, taking a step closer, forcing her to look me in the eye. My mother was a saint. I am not. Do not ever speak to me again, or I will have Arthur sue you for the remaining balance of the $4 million you still technically owe me. I turned on my heel and walked out of the courthouse into the bright, blinding sunshine, leaving the Kensington women standing in the shadows where they belonged. A week later, I signed the final divorce papers. Daniel had signed them from his jail cell. Because of his felony convictions and the crushing debt he owed in corporate restitution, the judge awarded me everything, completely nullifying any claim he might have tried to make. I was officially free. The final piece of business was Fox Hollow itself. I had zero desire to live in that sprawling, soulless mansion. It held too many toxic memories. Instead, I contacted a prominent commercial real estate developer. On a crisp autumn morning, I stood at the end of the driveway, with Arthur by my side. We watched as a massive yellow bulldozer drove straight through the pristine hedge maze and smashed into the grand portico of Fox Hollow. The sound of the oak doors splintering and the stone columns collapsing sounded like music. I had sold the 7-acre estate to the developer for $8 million on one strict, non-negotiable condition. They were not building another mansion. The property was rezoned. They were building a state-of-the-art, high-end, affordable, assisted living community for working-class retirees. People like my mother, who had worked their fingers to the bone their entire lives, would spend their golden years living on the most exclusive, beautiful land in the state. And inscribed on the heavy bronze plaque at the front gates, right where the Kensington crest used to be, were the words, "The Margaret Hayes Pavilion." I took the $8 million and invested it right back into the aggressive portfolio my mother had built, securing my financial freedom for the rest of my life. I quit my teaching job, not because I hated it, but because I wanted to travel. I bought a beautiful, cozy flat in Paris, filled it with books and art, and started writing the novel I had been putting off for a decade. Later that afternoon, I drove out to Oakwood Cemetery. The weather was a far cry from the freezing, apocalyptic storm of the funeral. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, and the autumn leaves were painted in vibrant shades of gold and amber. I knelt by my mother's polished granite headstone. I didn't bring flowers. I brought a small paper cup of her favorite hazelnut coffee. I set it gently on the grass. "We did it, Mum," I whispered, resting my hand on the warm stone. "They're gone. The house is gone. Ooh, one." I sat there for a long time, listening to the wind rustling through the old oak trees. I thought about the manila envelope Daniel had shoved into my hands right here on this exact spot. He had thought he was handing me my destruction. He didn't realize he was handing me the key to my own cage. I stood up, brushed the grass off my knees, and walked back to my car. I didn't look back. I had a flight to catch, a new life to build, and a world to see. I was Chloe Hayes again, and for the first time in 10 years, I was exactly where I was supposed to be. If you enjoyed this story of ultimate karma and absolute revenge, please hit that like button and share it with someone who loves a good comeback. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the bell so you never miss out on our daily dramatic stories. Let us know in the comments below. What would you have done if your husband handed you divorce papers at a funeral? Would you have been as ruthless as Chloe? Or would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts, and we'll see you in the next video.